China and Russia, Secretary Blinken spoke to our network and others over the weekend of concern based on information the US now has that the PRC is considering lethal support to Russia. Can you give an idea of the timing at which the US believes the PRC started considering giving lethal aid to Russia, and also of the nature of the weapons the PRC may be considering supplying to Russia?
Well, let me start by saying, we want to be very clear about this, we have not yet seen the PRC provide Russia with lethal aid, but we don't believe they've taken it off the table either. We are concerned, as you heard from the Secretary over the weekend, that China is considering providing lethal aid to support Russia in its aggression, its blatant aggression against Ukraine. We've made very clear to the PRC consistently, including in recent days when the Secretary met with Wang Yi in Munich, but also at the very earliest phase of this conflict when President Biden spoke with President Xi, that providing lethal weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine or systematic assistance with sanctions evasion would cause real consequence in our bilateral relationship. The PRC understands, we think, what's at risk were it to proceed with providing material support to Russia's war against Ukraine. We've been clear, we'll not hesitate to target Chinese companies or individuals that violate our sanctions, and we're monitoring very vigilantly for potential violations. China, we think, we are concerned, seriously risks miscalculating by continuing its support for Russia, which is directly impacting how the rest of the world is seeing the PRC. The reputational costs that the PRC is enduring is already very real, because the rest of the world sees the PRC, despite its veneer of neutrality, its self-professed neutrality, provide important forms of support to Russia already. It is providing diplomatic support. It's providing economic support. It's providing propaganda, spewing propaganda that serve to amplify the lies, the distortions, the mistruths, the half-truths in some cases, that are emanating from Moscow. So the rest of the world is watching this. We are watching very closely to determine if the PRC does actually decide to take that step to provide lethal aid. To your question about the time frame, look, this has been a concern of ours since even before Russia's aggression against Ukraine started. The burgeoning relationship between the PRC and Russia is one that has deepened in not in recent weeks, months, but really in recent years. And of course, the idea occurred to us even before the start of Russia's aggression that given the massive costs and consequences that we knew and we warned, we were prepared to impose against Russia should its invasion go forward, that Russia could reach out to its partners around the world to help step in, to help account for some of the consequences that ultimately were imposed on it as a result of its aggression. We have seen Russia do this with Iran. We've seen Russia do this with the DPRK. We've seen Russia resort to other means to resupply and to perpetrate its war against Ukraine. So this remains a very real concern of ours, and we're monitoring very closely. Anything else on this? Kylie?
We're nearing the one-year anniversary of the invasion on Friday. And so I'm just wondering, given President Putin's speech earlier this week, if the State Department feels like they're any closer to a diplomatic solution now than there was months ago.
So, Kylie, I think what is much less important is how we feel, and what is much more important is what we're hearing and what we're seeing. You heard President Putin's speech yesterday. I know this has been portrayed as a head-to-head with President Biden. Of course, that was not at all the case. Anyone who watched both speeches came away, I think, with the impression that they were seeing two vintage presentations. What we saw yesterday was vintage Putin. It was it was a sinister message. It was a message that offered little sign of hope or optimism for his own people, probably precisely because there was nothing he could say that would fundamentally change the reality that Russia is enduring right now, the reality that Russia's forces are enduring inside Ukraine, the reality that Russia itself is enduring as a result of the isolation, as a result of the export controls, as a result of the financial sanctions that the rest of the world has imposed on this. President Biden, on the other hand, it was vintage Joe Biden. It was a speech that was uplifting. It was a speech that was affirmative. It was a speech that was a stark reminder to the rest of the world about the stakes that are at play as we see a country attempt to do what the rules-based order that was established in the aftermath of the last World War has always sought to prevent. It was an affirmation of the strategy that America's led, that the rest of the world has worked with us to implement over the past 12 months. Now, to your question more precisely, look, what we've heard from President Putin has not altered our impression that Russia is not in a mood for diplomacy. Quite the opposite. We heard nothing in President Putin's speech yesterday that changed the pretty stark reminder that Russia gave us earlier this year, that Russia would only negotiate if its quote-unquote new territorial realities were respected. These are not the demands of a country that is interested at the moment in constructive negotiations and constructive diplomacy. These are not the statements of a country that at the moment is looking for an off-ramp. So in the interim, our approach will continue to be to recognize the nexus between the battlefield in Ukraine and the negotiating table that will ultimately emerge. We wholeheartedly agree with President Zelensky that the only way this conflict will end is through dialogue and diplomacy and at the negotiating table. Our goal is to continue to provide Ukraine with the assistance it needs, yes, security assistance, but also economic assistance and humanitarian assistance, so that when that negotiating table emerges, Ukraine will be in the strongest possible position. And so that in the interim, Ukraine will be in the position to exert maximum pressure on Russia to advance, to accelerate the emergence of that negotiating table. And on the other side of the ledger, we're going to continue to do what we've done since February 24th of last year. That is to mount costs and consequences on the Russian Federation. By any metric, you look at what Russia is enduring because of Mr. Putin's aggression, and you see very clearly those costs and consequences.